Hello, I'm Scott Carlton, Artistic Director of Singers Programs for the Wagner Society of New York. On behalf of Society President Natalie Wagner, we welcome you to a lecture by Professor Harlow Robinson. Before I introduce Professor Robinson, I'd like to mention the next scheduled Society event, a recital by Helena Brown. She is a soprano and was the recipient in 2018 of the Robert Lauch Memorial Fund Award. On Sunday, May 16th at 3 p.m., Helena will sing a recital of works by Dvorak, Wagner, several Black American female composers, and others. Helena Brown was ensemble soloist with the Metropolitan Opera at Porgy and Bess in 2019 and 2020. She has performed throughout the United States, including at the Glimmerglass Festival, and she is the recipient of numerous awards. We are very pleased to announce another program. We will give the transmission date for this program later. Maestro Yves Queller, who was the founder and director of Opera Orchestra of New York, presented Wagner's Rienzi, an early opera, numerous times in Washington, D.C. and New York between 1980 and 2012. We are pleased to be able to bring you a program honoring her and delving into Rienzi, including a performance of the famous Rienzi prayer by Society grantee Jeremy Browner. You will recognize him as one of the tenors in the Stefan Gould masterclass. Not many of us are aware that Rimsky-Korsakov was greatly influenced by Wagner's operas, starting with the production of The Ring by a touring German company in St. Petersburg in 1889. Professor Harlow Robinson is an author, lecturer, and Matthews Distinguished University Professor Emeritus of History at Northeastern University in Boston. He is an authority on Russian opera, and he has written and lectured widely. He is especially known for his biography of Sergei Prokofiev. His articles, essays, and reviews have appeared in many publications. He has lectured for the Metropolitan Opera Guild at Lincoln Center, the New York Philharmonic, and at many other venues. And he appeared on the Metropolitan Opera Saturday matinee radio broadcasts from 1994 to 2004. Professor Robinson has made over 27 trips to Russia and the former USSR since 1970. Thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you, Mr. Carlton. It's wonderful to be here today with all of you. Before we begin, I just wanted to thank a few people, Natalie Wagner of the Wagner Society for putting this together, my old friend Ellen Skarufi from Russia Days, who actually came up with this whole idea for this presentation with me, and of course our technical person, Griffin Kaiser, without whom this would not be possible. So my topic today is the history of Richard Wagner's influence on Russian music, especially on the operas of Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov. Let me begin with some comments on Wagner's relationship with Russia and Russian music more generally, before I turn finally to the special case of Rimsky, and in particular his late epic opera, The Legend of the Invisible City of Kitezh and the Maiden Fivronia. Wagner's personal experience of Russia, more precisely his experience of the Russian Empire, began relatively early in his career. In 1837, at the age of 24, Wagner moved to Riga in present-day Latvia to take the position as director of the German opera there. At the time, what is today Latvia, including the major port of Riga, one of the most important member cities of the Hanseatic League, were under Russian control. In fact, Riga was the administrative center of the Russian colonial government in the entire region, which included Latvia and Estonia, also known as Livonia. Russia had received this territory from Sweden in 1721, after the Great Northern War between Sweden and Russia in the early 18th century during the reign of Peter the Great. Riga was very important to the Russian presence on the east coast of the Baltic Sea, and the third largest city in the enormous Russian Empire at the end of the 19th century. It remained under Russian control until the end of World War I, when Latvia became an independent nation with Riga as its capital. But when Wagner came to Riga in 1837, the city's cultural life was dominated by the German aristocratic elite, the Baltic Germans, who had lived there for centuries. Germans constituted about half of the population, and German remained the official language of the city and the region until the end of the 19th century. Latvians lived primarily in rural areas and had little influence in the city's musical or cultural life until the 1860s and 70s. The Russian population was at the time small, but would grow rapidly during the post-World War II era when Latvia became part of the USSR. Wagner was invited to come from Königsberg, today that's also part of Russia, to become the artistic director and conductor at Riga's most important musical institution, the German Opera House. He accepted the offer in the hopes of earning enough money to pay off his many debts. His wife Minna joined him there in 1838, although it was not a happy reunion, as she entered into a relationship with the theater's manager. Although he allegedly didn't like the theater, which was small and cramped, it did, according to various sources, give him some ideas for the design of the theater he would later build in Bayreuth, an auditorium without windows, spare decor, and few boxes. While in Riga, Wagner also began writing his opera Rienzi, but he didn't get along with the director and was dismissed. He and Minna left Riga in 1839 on a ship that encountered a furious storm, allegedly the inspiration for the churning overture to Der Fliegende Holländer. The German opera fell into disuse and disrepair during the Soviet era following World War II, but the building was never demolished. In the last few years, a robust Latvian-German joint initiative project, the Renaissance of the Wagner Theater Riga, has begun serious renovation of the structure. Originally built in 1781 in the heart of what is today the beautiful historical center of the city. They are currently raising 35 million euros to fund the renovation and hope to reopen the theater and building as a major cultural site in the near future. And we're going to share with you the website where you can go and find out more about this or donate if you choose. There is no evidence that Wagner interacted with the Russian cultural or musical community during his 2 years in Riga. At the time, Russian classical music was still in its infancy. Mikhail Glinka's opera, A Life for the Tsar, had received its premiere in St. Petersburg in 1836, just 1 year before Wagner arrived in Riga. The next chapter of Wagner's involvement with Russia came 25 years later, in 1862, when he accepted an invitation from the St. Petersburg Philharmonic Society to conduct 2 concerts in the Russian capital. He arrived there in early 1863 and stayed in Russia for 2 months, considerably longer than originally planned. And here I'm indebted to Rosamund Bartlett's excellent book, Wagner and Russia, for much of the following information. By this time, Wagner was a musical celebrity, well known in Russian musical circles, and he'd already completed Rienzi, Der Fliegende Holländer, Tannhäuser, Lohengrin, Das Rheingold, Die Walküre, and Siegfried. Wagner was also well known to Tsar Alexander II's secret police, which had branded him a, quote, suspicious and politically suspect person, unquote, owing to his earlier infatuation with revolutionary causes, particularly the nationalistic uprisings around Europe in 1848. Although Wagner complained about his horrifying journey to Russia and the cold weather, he was favorably impressed with the quality of the musicians in the orchestra he conducted. The concerts included numerous excerpts from his recent works and received a rapturous reception from the large audiences. I've never had such a warm reception as I've had here in Russia, he wrote to a friend in Germany. The audience almost devoured me. Among those in the audience was the 20-year-old Tchaikovsky, who later told his patron, Nadezhda von Meck, that Wagner's conducting of Beethoven's symphonies achieved a, quote, unattainable greatness, unquote. Rimsky-Korsakov, then 19 years old, did not attend, since he was abroad on naval duty. But he received a letter from another member of the nationalistic St. Petersburg composers called the Mighty Handful, Mili Balakirev, telling him that the Wagner concert he attended had contained, quote, nothing new or interesting, unquote. Rimsky would come to disagree strongly with that assessment in the coming years. In St. Petersburg, Wagner met several members of the court of Tsar Alexander II, who had freed the serfs just a few years before. Wagner also spent more than a month in Moscow, where he conducted concerts of his music at the Bolshoi Theater before returning to St. Petersburg at the end of his tour. So generous was the reception and the financial remuneration he received in Russia in 1863 that Wagner began making plans to return. But the second trip never took place, and the financial patronage of King Ludwig II of Bavaria that began soon afterwards removed the need for touring to make money. Wagner's concerts in Russia were covered extensively and mostly positively in the Russian press. Like others, however, the leading music critic Feofil Tolstoy, not Leo, found Wagner's, at the time, unusual practice of conducting while facing the orchestra instead of facing the audience disarming. He described the music of Tristan and Isolde as full of, quote, huge apparitions, unquote. Other reviewers bemoaned the popularity of German and Italian music, especially Verdi's, in Russian theaters at the expense of Russian composers, but asserted, without really explaining why, that Russians were better equipped than other nationalities to understand Wagner's new musical style. Over the next 25 years, productions of Lohengrin, Tannhäuser, and Rienzi were mounted at Russian theaters. The first performances of the complete Ring cycle in the new Festspielhaus in Bayreuth in the summer of 1876 attracted a number of important figures in the Russian musical world, including Tchaikovsky, who reviewed the event for the Russian periodical Russkie Vedomosti. In private comments to his brother Modest, Tchaikovsky expressed strong reservations. Maybe The Ring is a great composition, but I have never heard anything so boring and so drawn out as this. A collection of the most complicated harmonies, the singing parts colorless, unending dialogues, a hellish darkness in the theater, lack of interest in poetry in the subject. All this is excessively tiring to the nerves. And is this what Wagner's reform is leading to? Up to now, one tried to charm people by music. Now, one tortures and exhausts them. There are, of course, beautiful parts, but the whole thing together bores me to death. Perhaps fearful of offending Wagner's numerous supporters in the Russian musical world, however, Tchaikovsky was much more laudatory in his published review, calling The Ring one of the most significant events in the history of art. The subject of Wagner's influence on Tchaikovsky is a large topic I won't try to address here today, but it's worth mentioning that he continued to attend performances of Wagner's operas on his many trips to Europe and commented upon them in letters to friends back home. Tchaikovsky was particularly drawn to Parsifal, which he encountered in 1884, and he admitted to Sergei Taneyev that Wagner's music had exerted some influence on him. Rimsky-Korsakov noted Wagnerian influence in the passages depicting the sea in the symphonic fantasia, The Tempest. Another member of the Mighty Handful composer, Cesar Cui, saw Wagnerian traces in the symphonic fantasia Francesca da Rimini, composed soon after Tchaikovsky's visit to Bayreuth. Tchaikovsky's operas, however, are another story and really do not show very deep influence of Wagner. One of the most Wagnerian of Tchaikovsky's scores, in my view, is his Manfred Symphony, composed in 1885. Inspired by Byron's romantic poem about secret incest and guilt, Tchaikovsky developed this programmatic work using the same organizational principle he had used so effectively in his Fourth Symphony, the use of recurring fate motif as a central unifying structural and emotional idea. This motif and another theme act as leitmotifs, developed into a psychological epic drama reminiscent of the orchestral music of The Ring. Here, too, Tchaikovsky blurs the line between symphonic and dramatic, even operatic music, a trait he admired in Wagner's music. And here we'll hear the opening of the Manfred Symphony as played by the Frankfurt Radio Symphony, conducted by Vasily Petrenko. And you'll hear the opening, which is the most important theme that is developed over and over as a representation of Manfred's obsession. But the real turning point in the popularity and influence of Wagner's operas in Russia came 4 years later in 1889, when the complete Ring cycle was presented for the first time by a touring company from Prague in St. Petersburg. And this is where Rimsky also re-enters our story. Let me take a slight detour here to tell you a bit more about Rimsky and where he was in his career at the moment that he encountered Wagner's Ring. When Rimsky-Korsakov died in 1908, on the eve of the Bolshevik Revolution, he left behind a musical legacy of staggering proportions. As a composer, he had finished 15 operas, 3 symphonies, tone poems like Scheherazade and Capriccio Espagnol, concerti, chamber music, and scores of folk and art songs. As an editor, he helped prepare Glinka's 2 operas, A Life for the Tsar and Ruslan and Ludmila, for publication, helped to complete, edit, and orchestrate Alexander Borodin's unfinished opera, Prince Igor, and of course, edited, orchestrated, and arranged versions of Mussorgsky's operas, Boris Godunov and Khovanshina. As a pedagogue, he trained Stravinsky, Prokofiev, Glazunov, and many others, and wrote textbooks on harmony, instrumentation, and orchestration. The day Rimsky-Korsakov died, the 17-year-old Prokofiev wrote in his diary, "I admired him and thought, that was a man who attained real success and fame." And yet, history has dealt somewhat strangely with Rimsky-Korsakov. In Russia, he's long been regarded as one of the saints of the glorious 19th century realistic Russian musical tradition. Even the watchdogs of Soviet socialist realism found his work politically correct. His operas have for many years held the stage at the Mariinsky in St. Petersburg, formerly Leningrad, and the Bolshoi in Moscow. The St. Petersburg Conservatory, where he taught so energetically for so many years, bears Rimsky's name. On the walls of the Great Hall of the Tchaikovsky Conservatory in Moscow, his portrait hangs near those of Beethoven, Bach, and Wagner. His birthplace in the village of Tikhvin, not far from St. Petersburg, and the apartment in the city where he spent the last 15 years of his life, are lovingly tended museums where visitors file by the smallest artifacts of his daily life in silent reverence and awe. Outside Russia, however, Rimsky has remained a somewhat peripheral figure, almost more famous for his brilliant students and for his controversial editions of Mussorgsky's operas than for his own music. Ironically, it is for Scheherazade and Capriccio Espagnol and the Russian Easter Overture, showy pieces that he tossed off quickly, that he is best known to a broad Western audience. His many operas, composed slowly and conscientiously over a period of 37 years, with the possible exception of the Golden Cockerel, have remained largely unknown outside Russia, although Rimsky regarded them as his most important contribution to Russian and world music. Adding insult to injury, Rimsky's versions of Boris Godunov and Cholanchina, long a fixture of the 20th century international repertoire, have in recent years been replaced by most opera companies with more authentic editions, and their editor has been assailed by scholars and conductors for tampering with Mussorgsky's more profound original ideas. So why, in this era of revivals and discoveries, when directors rush to drag forgotten works by forgotten composers out of the archives and stage them extravagantly, did Rimsky's operas so long languish in relative neglect? The answer is both linguistic and political. During the Soviet period, very few Russian singers, conductors, or directors were allowed to travel abroad for performances. Since the collapse of the USSR in 1991, that situation has changed dramatically, with very positive results for both performers and audiences. Suddenly, the stages of leading American and European opera houses, including the Met, of course, have been flooded with major Russian and East European talent, now freed to work in the international operatic marketplace. And this has also made it possible to mount performances of large-scale Russian works, including such masterpieces by Rimsky as The Legend of the Invisible City of Kitezh and The Maiden Fimronia, and Mlada. In fact, The Legend of the Invisible City of Kitezh was done at BAM in a concert version by the Mariinsky Theater in the early 1990s. Of Rimsky-Korsakov's 15 completed operas, 3 are based on subjects of early Russian history: The Maid of Pskov, Boyarina Vera Sheloga, The Tsar's Bride; 1 on a Polish subject, Pan Voyevoda; 5 on Russian fairy tales or legends, The Legend of the Invisible City of Kitezh, The Snow Maiden, Mlada, Sadko, Cachet the Immortal; 2 on Ukrainian folktales by Nikolai Gogol, May Night, Christmas Eve; 3 on works by Alexander Pushkin, Mozart and Salieri, Tsar Sultan, The Golden Cockerel; and 1 on a Russian historical drama set in ancient Rome, Servilia. As a leading member of the group of nationalist Russian composers known as the Five or the Mighty Handful, Moguchaya Kuchka, Rimsky believed deeply that he should produce opera inspired by Russian history, literature, folklore, and folk song. This conviction was in part a reaction against the long-standing domination of Russian musical life until almost 1860 by foreign composers and musicians, especially Italians, who had been imported by the Tsarist court. Before the second half of the 19th century, even native Russian composers often wrote opera in Italian. Rimsky-Korsakov, Mussorgsky, Cui, Borodin, and Balakirev set out intentionally to change this situation and create a self-conscious and independent Russian operatic tradition. For the Five, opera was the most important and necessary genre. Because it told a story and was a multimedia attraction, it could appeal to the broadest possible audience and generate nationalistic feeling. Rimsky-Korsakov finished his first opera, The Maid of Pskov, when he was only 28. Only recently had he decided to make a serious career in music. As a young man, he studied at the Petersburg Naval Institute and spent 3 years, 1862 to 65, cruising around the world on the vessel Diamond. And on this visit to the United States, where he actually saw Niagara Falls And he also went to New York, where he saw what he called rather poor performances of Meyerbeer's Robert le Diable and Gounod's Faust. So underdeveloped was the Russian musical world that in 1871, Rimsky-Korsakov, who had no systematic musical training, was appointed a professor at the Petersburg Conservatory. He set about teaching himself as well as his students the fundamentals of theory, harmony, and orchestration, and he soon became a demanding and rigorous pedagogue. Rimsky completed his first opera in 1872, 1 year after he became a professor. After that, he produced on average one opera every 3 years, working on his own music mainly in the summer when he was on vacation from teaching. While the operas vary widely in subject matter and atmosphere, as we have seen, they do share certain features. These include an alluring exoticism, often of the Oriental variety, a remarkable pictorial sense, refinement, and a subtle command of proportion, what Rimsky's protege Igor Stravinsky later called a melodic and harmonic inspiration full of freshness, a strong feeling for the unique synthesis of visual, musical, choreographic, and verbal elements possible only on the operatic stage, and of course, an unmatched genius for orchestration that is the hallmark of the composer's style. Pageantry, not psychology, was Rimsky's strong suit. Now, to return to Rimsky's reaction to the first performances in Russia of Wagner's Ring Cycle in 1889. By this time, Wagner's music was well known, and all the performances of 4 cycles sold out quickly. Even Tsar Alexander III attended. Rimsky, a professor at St. Petersburg Conservatory, was so excited that he sat in, along with the composer Alexander Glazunov, at every single rehearsal, following them score in hand, as he wrote later in his autobiography, My Musical Life. Wagner's method of orchestration struck Glazunov and me, he continues, and his stylistic devices gradually made their way into our orchestral practice. In a letter to Tchaikovsky, Glazunov confirmed Rimsky's infatuation. I have rarely been in such a state of ecstasy. Nikolai Andreevich is no less enamored with Wagner than I am. We were simply under some sort of spell. To judge by certain signs, Wagner has exercised a beneficial influence on Nikolai Andreevich. He's now thinking about composing something on a large scale. Russian musicologist M.P. Rachmanova asserts that his first exposure to Wagner's tetralogy was for Rimsky-Korsakov something like a spark thrown into a cellar full of gunpowder. The resulting explosion produced a new opera, directly inspired by his experience of the ring, Mlada. Actually, this wasn't an entirely new opera, but an old project he had abandoned 17 years earlier. In 1872, 4 of the members of the mighty handful, all but Balakirev, had pooled their talents in creating a collective, lavish opera ballet designed to show off the many resources of the new Mariinsky Theater. The composers, all of them young, inexperienced, and in need of money, worked from a pallid libretto by V.A. Krylov about the 9th century Baltic Slavs. Kui was assigned to produce Act 1, and Borodin Act 4, while Rimsky and Mussorgsky divided up the rest rather haphazardly. All 4 quickly tired of the awkward and restrictive arrangement, however, and reacted with relief when the commission was canceled after only a few months of work. Each composer subsequently recycled the music he had produced for the project into other compositions. Some of Borodin's contribution ended up in his opera, Prince Igor. In early 1889, the composer Anatoly Lyadov suggested to Rimsky that he take a second look at Mlada. He started to work immediately, filling in gaps in the Krylov libretto himself. And here I quote the musicologist M.P. Rachmanova. Alone in Russian 19th century musical culture, Rimsky-Korsakov, like Wagner, alone in Western European culture, became an agent for a mythological consciousness. The old libretto of the collective Mlada served only as a starting point. His own Mlada is an individualistic treatment of myth like Wagner's Ring. Glazunov agreed. What was lacking in his earlier operas you can find here. Here you will find a certain Wagnerism. In the midst of completing Mlada, Rimsky had the good fortune to see a production of Der Fliegende Holländer on a trip to Brussels. Rimsky's libretto from Mlada overflows with pageantry, nationalism, pagan deities, bloody revenge, demons, and spells. The action is set in the 9th or 10th century on the Slavic Baltic coast in present-day Pomerania. For many Russian artists, this pre-Christian era represented a lost golden age of freedom, bravery, and nobility, exercising something like the appeal to post-industrial minds of the legend of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, or the medieval heroes of Wagner's operas. From the start, Rimsky conceived of Mlada not as a traditional opera, but an opera ballet. The role of Princess Mlada, who is already dead, she's been murdered by the time the curtain rises, is given not to a singer, but a dancer, appearing as a ghost to the hero Prince Jaromir. Extensive ballet scenes occur throughout, including, among others, a market scene, various Slavic pagan folk rituals, and a fantastic sequence set in ancient Egypt that features a seductive dance by the ghost of Cleopatra, another non-singing role. And here you will see a fairly recent production of Mlada by the Bolshoi Theater, which is also available now on DVD. Mlada's schematic plot revolves around standard operatic ingredients: love, envy, greed, and revenge. Mlada, the fiancée of Prince Jaromir, has been murdered by the rival Prince Stivoi and his jealous Amneris-like daughter Voislava. Voislava enlists the help of powerful underworld spirits to win Jaromir's heart and initially succeeds. Soon, however, good spirits rally to Jaromir's side and show him through a dream sequence how Voislava poisoned Mlada. Good and evil powers fight it out with the help of lavish stage effects. In an extravagant environmental finale heavily indebted to Wagner's Götterdämmerung, Jaromir and Mlada emerge above an apocalyptic storm, flood, and cathartic rainbow, blissfully reunited in the hereafter. As in The Ring, nature appears as a major character. Musically, no less than scenically, Mlada is one of Rimsky's most ambitious creations. He said later he resolved not to skimp on the orchestral forces, having in mind an enlarged orchestra, something like Wagner's in Nibelungen. My orchestral intentions were new and intricate, in the style of Wagner. In fact, Mlada boasts the largest and most varied orchestra of any of Rimsky's operas, including expanded wind, brass, and percussion sections, and 3 harps and an organ for spice and color. In Acts 2 and 4, 12 musicians playing non-chromatic horns appear on stage, while the elaborate Cleopatra scene in Act 3 calls for a stage band that includes 2 panpipes and 8 lyres. The influence of folk song is frequently evident in the vocal writing, and especially in the many choral sections. There are also plenty of fanfares and processionals, such as the glittering brass showcase, Procession of the Nobles, in Act 2, Scene 3, the most famous excerpt from Mlada, included as the final section in the 5-movement orchestral suite Rimsky fashioned from the opera's score a few years later. And here, take a look at Procession of the Nobles.
Дорогу им народ ротарский.
Structurally, the opera consists of a series of connected set pieces rather than an integrated through composed symphonic whole employing leitmotifs in Wagnerian style. But as Rachmanova points out, Rimsky's leitmotifs are quite different, often based on folk genres and vocal style melodies, while the symphonic variations are primarily coloristic, not symphonic. At moments, Rimsky seems even to be borrowing directly from Wagner. There's a striking similarity between the opening love theme of Tristan and the fate theme in Mlada, associated with the love of Mlada and Jaromir. Not surprisingly, the heavy production demands posed by Mlada slowed its progress to the stage. Its premiere at the Mariinsky Theater on November the 1st, 1892, did not enjoy success with the public or critics. For years afterward, Rimsky was highly critical of the dramatic shortcomings of his only opera ballet, but not long before his death, he came to take a more positive view of what is one of his most colorful and imaginative works. "I'm satisfied with it," he wrote to a friend. Nor is there any question that Rimsky's fairy tale operas, especially Mlada, exerted a huge influence on the next generation of Russian composers, particularly Stravinsky and Prokofiev. In his work for the stage, Stravinsky would mix and combine dance, instrumental music, vocal soloists, chorus, and spoken texts in new and startling combinations, smashing the boundaries of conventional genres. And in his early operas, Love for Three Oranges and ballets, Chou, Prokofiev drew heavily upon the exotic fairy tale world created by his teacher, adding a sarcastic modern edge. In many ways, the visionary Mlada was years ahead of its time and prefigured the modernist revolution in the arts that would explode in the coming decades. The first complete production of the Ring cycle, staged by a Russian opera house, took place in the 1907-1908 season at the Mariinsky Theater, at the time the most prestigious and well-funded theater in Russia. By then, all the operas of the Ring had been staged separately at the Mariinsky, beginning with Die Walküre in 1900. The entire cycle was given at the Mariinsky for 3 consecutive seasons from 1907 through 1910. The performances sold out immediately and were attended by many members of Petersburg high society, as well as serious musicians. The enormous popular and critical success of these Ring performances signaled that Russian audiences and critics had fully embraced Wagner and Wagnerism. As one critic wrote, "In Russia, the country next to Wagner's motherland, which is honored to have contributed a few prominent pages to his biography, the name of Wagner is becoming even dearer and closer to us. People are learning to grasp and understand him more deeply and more clearly." Ironically, Rimsky-Korsakov, one of the first Russian composers to grasp and even imitate Wagner's musical style, was in the final months of his life at the time of this first Russian production of The Ring in early 1908. But in the preceding season, on February 20, 1907, the Mariinsky had produced what is arguably Rimsky's most Wagnerian opera, Skazanie o Nevidinom Grade Kitije I Dieve Fevronii, The Legend of the Invisible City of Kitezh and the Maiden Fevronia. Rimsky had first thought of writing this opera as early as the winter of 1898-99, but didn't turn to it seriously until around 1903. From the beginning, his main collaborator on the project was the librettist Vladimir Ivanovich Bielsky, with whom he also worked on several other operas, including Sadko, The Tale of Tsar Sultan, and his last opera, The Golden Cockerel. Bielsky's libretto for Kitezh was based on 3 sources: 2 novels by the 19th century writer Pavel Ivanovich Melnikov, In the Woods and In the Hills, the 16th century Russian text, The Tale of Peter and Fevronia of Murom, Povest o Petre I Fevronii Muromskich, by Hermalos Erasmus, and Russian legends about the fantastic city of Kitezh. In his two novels published in the 1870s, Melnikov wrote about life in the Russian provinces near Nizhny Novgorod, especially the isolated world of the Russian Orthodox Old Believers, ultra-conservative schismatics who had broken with the established church in the 16th century and formed their own communities in remote areas of Russia, Siberia, and Alaska. The tale of Peter and Fevronia of Murom combines elements of hagiography, lives of the saints, with a more secular style that was developing in Russian literature in the late 1500s and 1600s. Bielsky and Rimsky take great liberties with the tale, preserving the character of Fevronia, a virtuous peasant woman who marries a prince. In the libretto, he becomes Prince Vsevolod Yuryevich of Kitezh. Kitezh is a legendary and mythical city beneath the waters of Lake Svetlo Yar in the Nizhny Novgorod region of central Russia beyond the Volga River. Reference to Kitezh appears for the first time in the Kitezh Chronicle, an anonymous book from the late 18th century, believed to have originated among the Old Believers. Bielsky and Rimsky retain the most important feature of the Kitezh legends. Its inhabitants avoid annihilation from the invading Tartar armies by praying with such intensity that their beautiful city, full of gleaming churches, sinks into Lake Svetlo Yar, saving them and their holy city. When the weather is calm, the legend goes, chiming bells and singing can be heard floating above the water, especially by those who are truly pious. The action of the Kitezh legends takes place in the early 13th century, when Batu Khan and his Tartar forces overran Russia, which they occupied for the next 250 years. Bielsky and Rimsky gave to the opera the generic title Skazanie, referring to a genre of old Russian and folk literature, a prose narrative telling of events in the distant past, often of a mythical or religious nature, probably best translated as legend. It's often translated as tale. It's interesting to compare the title to the one Wagner bestowed upon Parsifal, Bühnenbeispiel, meaning stage dedication play. In both cases, the librettist, Wagner, of course, wrote his own, and composers were striving to convey that their operas had a special mytho-religious character and a setting that transcended reality and specific dating. Significant, too, is the fact that Wagner's primary source for his libretto comes from an early 13th century text, the romance Parsifal. So both operas are set in a semi-mythical early 13th century. According to the ancient Russian calendar, the chronological setting of Kitezh was, as is stated on the title page, the year since the creation of the world, 6751. The language of the libretto of Kitezh also possesses an old Russian flavor, with frequent use of archaic vocabulary and expressions. We know that Rimsky was very much aware of Parsifal from various sources, including his autobiography and the memoirs of his associate Vasily Yavstudepsev. He attended a performance of the prelude at one of the symphony evenings of the Russian Musical Society in 1901, and mentions aspects of the score in several other conversations. Several Russian musical journals published extensive articles on Parsifal. It seems highly likely Rimsky had seen and studied the full score, which had been widely available since 1883, especially in his capacity as an instructor of orchestration at the St. Petersburg Conservatory. But by the time the first complete performance of Parsifal was given in St. Petersburg in early 1906, arranged by the arts patron Count Alexander Sheremetyev, over the course of 3 Sunday afternoons, Rimsky had already finished the score of Kitezh. In that 1906 performance of Parsifal, an electric light was used for the Holy Grail, which was, quote, condemned as utter bad taste, unquote, by a leading musical journal. There is no precise information available that Rimsky was present at this performance, but it seems extremely likely, given his interest in Wagner's music and orchestration more generally. So clearly, by the time Rimsky was composing Kitezh, he was quite familiar with the score of Parsifal. In March 1903, Yapsivtsev recorded in his journal that Rimsky had told him he intended to write Kitezh, quote, in a very Russian style and to orchestrate it as interestingly as possible, a la Tristan. The score will call for one less instrument than Mlada, 4 French horns instead of 6, 2 tubas instead of 1. The action of the opera opens in a forest, as does Parsifal. A brief overture in praise of the wilderness sets the scene. The opera's 3 main leitmotifs are introduced in turn. First, a shimmering figure in strings, hereafter associated with the forest, then a plaintive melody in the oboe that expresses Fevronia's pure romantic nature, followed by a more stately ceremonial theme in the flute, oboes, and strings, representing the pure love of Fevronia and Prince Vsevolod. And here, for purposes of comparison, I want to show you the opening of first Parsifal and then of Kitezh. The Parsifal production is from a DVD that was, this was a performance at the Met Opera Orchestra and Chorus with James Levine. And the Kitezh is also a DVD of a production that was given at the Netherlands Opera and directed by Dmitry Chernakov. He's a very active Russian opera director, somewhat controversial, always interesting takes on the pieces that he does do. And you'll notice this Kitezh, it's very untraditional. We are not, it's not set in ancient Russia. It's set sometime in the much more recent past, as you can tell from the costuming. And it's a really very different take on Kitezh. But you will see here the opening also of that.
Auf, ihr Knabe, seht nach dem Bad, Zeit ist, des Königs Ort zu harren. Seht sie stellt, dass sie trägt voraus, seht die Bote komm uns nah. Ein euch, Antwort das heut, wohl früh verlangt nach dem Paare, das Heilkraut, das gab mit List und Kühnheit ihm gewann. Ich wähne, dass es Lindrum schuf, das wenn es tut, wird doch alles weiß. Ihm kehrt es Ehren Westen, befall mir eifrig uns das Brot.
In Act 1, Fevroni expresses her pantheistic joy, joined by various birds and animals. Her solitude is interrupted by the appearance of Prince Vsevolod Yurievich, son of Prince Yuri, the ruler of nearby Kitezh. She binds a wound he has received in a struggle with a bear. She tells him of her love of the forest and its creatures. Immediately taken by her innocence and compassion, Vsevolod expresses his love for her. Their ecstatic duet is interrupted by the horns and voices of the Streltsy, his soldier comrades. They sing several folk melodies before he leaves to join them. His friend Fyodor Bayarok comes across Fevronia and reveals the royal identity of the man she is now in love with as Act 1 ends. After the intimacy of Act 1, Act 2 takes us to a public scene in the main square of Malý Kitezh on the banks of the Volga. There's Mali Kitezh and Veliki Kitezh, Great Kitezh and Small Kitezh, but they're close to each other. Some time has passed, and Prince Vsevolod has announced his intention to marry Fevronia. Merchants are selling their wares as crowds mill around in expectation that the couple will arrive for the wedding ceremony. Here, we enter a folksy, colorful musical world, familiar from Rimsky's fairy tale operas such as Sadko, Tsar Sultan, The Snow Maiden, and Christmas Eve, populated by minstrels, beggars, and bear trainers. The perpetually drunk Grisha Kuterma leads the crown in a song celebrating vagabonds and tells them about Fevronia and the prince. The carriage bearing the couple enters to great fanfare with onstage gusli, domra, and cymbal players. Grisha insults Fevronia since she is only a lowly peasant betrothed to their prince. But displaying Christian humility and forgiveness, she immediately takes pity upon him. And Fevronia, by the way, is being sung by Svitlana Ignatovich. After more celebratory singing, the carriage takes Prince Vsevolod and his entourage away. Suddenly, the sounds of approaching horsemen are heard. It is the Tartars on the way to attack Kitezh. The bloodthirsty Tartar leaders Bidyai and Burundai demand someone show them the way to the city. Threatened with torture, the cowardly Grisha agrees. The Tartars drag Fevronia away with them. As Act 2 ends, she calls out to God to make great Kitezh disappear. This is from the original legend where the city sinks into the lake. And it's only visible to believers, but not to non-believers, such as the Tartars.
In bit po waszemu
Act 3 takes place in the great city of Kitezh. Grand Prince Yuri, Vsevolod's father, summons the people to announce the impending Tartar attack. Grisha has spread a false rumor that Fevronia is leading them to the city. Yuri laments the loss of his vision for Kitezh as a place of shelter from earthly sufferings and for spiritual regeneration. His vision seems close to the utopian ideal expressed in Parsifal and to the sense of a holy community embraced by the old believers. In response to his prayer, the city disappears into paradise along with its citizens. The Tatars see only a flaming cross. And the role of Prince Yuri here, by the way, is sung by Vladimir Vaniev.
Тебя
A symphonic interlude, the Battle of Kerzhenets, illustrates the bloody battle. In the second scene, Grisha leads the Tartars, drunk and quarreling over the loot they have plundered, towards Kitezh. Fevronia is still held captive and hears about the death of her betrothed Prince Vsevolod. Grisha has been tortured and tied to a tree by the Tartars. Saintly Fevronia takes pity on Grisha and tries to rescue him. When dawn breaks, Grisha sees Kitezh, although the Tartars cannot, and loses his mind. He runs off, dragging Fevronia with him. And finally, Act 4 takes place again in the forest, like Act 1. Fevronia is alone with Grisha, who's becoming more and more delirious and insane. She teaches him to pray, but he's plagued by demons and runs off into the wilderness. Really, he is a representation of the demonic forces here. Now alone again, as in Act 1, Fevronia sees a vision of her dead Vsevolod, identified in the score as the ghost, with whom she's now united in paradise, in a lengthy and ecstatic concluding scene. They enter a hereafter that feels and sounds not unlike Valhalla. Like Parsifal, Kitej ends with a chorus of affirmation of the Christian virtues of meekness, selfless love, and tears of emotion. These values ultimately defeat the forces of evil in the characters of Kundry and Grisha, respectively. And here, let's look at the final scene from each of these operas in turn. First from Kitezh, and then from Parsifal.
Написал.
So now I hear some of you asking, why did the legend of the invisible city of Kitezh become known as the Russian Parsifal? Do they really have that much in common? Was it only the wishful thinking of Russian critics who wanted a composer to whom they could ascribe the same towering stature that Wagner enjoyed? Musicologist Edward Garden, author of many seminal works in Russian music, thinks that calling Kitezh the Russian Parsifal is, quote, a rather fanciful notion. But he notes that both operas blend Christianity with nature worship and pantheism. Both operas are concerned above all with compassion. Fevroni embodies Orthodox ideals of humility and love for all living beings, exemplified in her closeness with the natural world and her willingness to forgive Grisha, who represents the powers of evil or the devil, even as he blasphemes and impugns her reputation. In both operas, the main characters search for true Christianity and brotherhood, for a future state of grace. What is very different, of course, is that Rimsky's opera revolves around a female protagonist, while the only female character in Parsifal is the temptress Kundry, the embodiment of carnal temptation and sin. Significantly, both Kitezh and Parsifal come at the very end of the long careers of both Wagner and Rimsky, when both men presumably were more concerned with issues of sin, virtue, immortality, and the idea of an afterlife. As I pointed out earlier, Rimsky most certainly used Wagner's orchestration as a model, but added to it a decisively Russian folk flavor and color. Further, he writes here in a flowing arioso style without separation into recitative and aria, characteristic of his earlier operas. The bells in the final apotheosis recall Parsifal quite directly, as does the opening forest scene as mentioned earlier. Of the important Russian operatic composers, Rimsky is without question the most enthusiastic Wagnerian. His frequent choice of mythological, historical, and fairy tale subjects from the distant past sets him far apart from Tchaikovsky, most of whose operas are set in the more recent past, Eugene Onegin, Queen of Spades, and show a closer kinship with Italian and French models. He's much more interested in ideas of individual psychology rather than the collective, as is Rimsky. Nor is Tchaikovsky interested in mythology or the themes of redemption and Christianity that Rimsky addresses in Kitezh, except possibly in The Maid of Orleans and Iolanta, but these are really only very descriptive of these events. With its spare realistic style, Mussorgsky's pessimistic Boris Godunov has very little in common with Wagner's operas. Borodin's Prince Igor treats Christianity as a mere entertainment and even allows the Russians to fraternize happily with the infidel invaders, shown as noble savages worthy of respect. Of all the major composers active around 1900, the most Wagnerian in spirit in Russia was probably Alexander Scriabin, who embraced all manner of mystical and philosophical ideas and fervently believed in the transformative spiritual power of music. But he didn't write operas. By all accounts, the modest and unassuming Rimsky, who shared none of Wagner's megalomania or boundless ambition, shunned the label of the Russian Wagner that some liked to give him. The more philosophical and mystical elements of Kitezh owe a great deal to the librettist, Belsky, a devotee of the ideas of the influential symbolist movement in Russian culture at the turn of the century. That Rimsky was uncomfortable as the Russian Wagner seems evident from the fact that for his next and last opera, he returned to the safe world of comic satire in a fairy tale setting with what many consider to be his finest opera, The Golden Cockerel. The legend of the invisible city of Kitezh stands as a marvelous but lonely monument in Rimsky's career. even in the history of Russian music. A fascinating testament to the power of Wagner's ideas and music. Thank you.